Is Indiana in the Morning, presented by First Commonwealth Bank here on WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160. Fascinating topic, the Flying Tigers. Sam Kleiner is on the telephone with us right now. He's the author, The Flying Tigers, the untold story of the American pilots who waged a secret war against Japan. Good morning to you. So good to talk with you today.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me on. Pleasure to talk with you.
This is, of course, the Flying Tigers, one of the groups of legend that maybe are fading a little bit, and it's so good that you're able to bring them back to our attention because the stories that must roll from or have rolled from the tongues of these guys and gals who were involved in the Flying Tigers, boy, I'd hate to see them disappear, and you were able to talk with a whole bunch of people. Let's start there with how you were able to source this book about this amazing group, the Flying Tigers.
Thank you so much. And I do think this is one of the great untold stories from the greatest generation. And listeners might be familiar with the famous shark-faced P-40 plane or have seen the John Wayne movie, The Flying Tigers. But the real story of the Flying Tigers, basically this covert unit that was sent over to China even before Pearl Harbor to fight against the Japanese, hasn't really been told. And so I, over the past couple of years, have been fortunate to, as a historian, to be one of the first historians to go to the Flying Tigers reunions. And they've been hosting these since 1952. And now there's only a couple survivors left. And actually now there's one gentleman left. And through that network of just getting to know these families, I've been able to track down a huge amount of original archival material that's never been seen before. So letters, diaries, a huge trove of combat reports that I found in a basement in Washington, D.C. that had been basically gathering dust, as well as photographs that really tell the story of the Flying Tigers through the lens of these young men and actually some women who were part of this unit. And so readers get to experience what it was like to be part of this unit from the inside. And I'm not a pilot, and I'm not a veteran, but I have a great love for this period in history. My grandfather was a navigator on a B-25, and I wanted to be able to take people on this journey alongside the pilots and the crew members that were part of this unit. And I think it's just a wonderful story, and it's so great to be able to bring it to life.
In today's society, of course, maybe the isolationist aspect that you just mentioned of American society, the real battle that was going on here made it necessary for this to be so covert, and that's why the stories are so hidden from us. Talk, if you would, for a few moments about why it was that America and America's leaders were able to get this system up and running with the Flying Tigers, despite the fact that we really had to keep it hidden.
Absolutely, and that's a very important point. And so much of this stuff was really lost because this was a covert unit, and there was a lot of secrecy around it. So these papers didn't all just end up in a neat collection at the National Archives. So they were really just sprawled out where individual families would have, a set of letters or a diary or these combat reports. And piecing that all together has been a passion of mine over the past number of years. And the book really has that deep sense of history to it. And at the time, the Roosevelt administration was actively working to help the Allies where they could, Great Britain and China, which were each fighting, wars across the Atlantic and the Pacific. But America was really focused on staying out of the war, and the isolationist Congress was passed these neutrality acts that restricted what America could do to help the Allies. That's where the whole idea of America First came from, was this large isolationist movement. But Roosevelt did what he could, turning America into what he called the arsenal of democracy, trying to help Great Britain and China where he could. And that's really where the Flying Tigers came from. It was a covert unit of 100 P-40 planes and around 100 pilots, and they're sent to the other side of the world. And they find themselves there on Pearl Harbor, and then quickly jump into battle. Just 2 weeks later, shoot down a number of Japanese bombers over Kunming, China, and that quickly becomes the inspiration that Americans need to believe that we'd be able to win this war. And that's really what makes this story so powerful to me, is these are guys who were really there the first weeks of the war, right after the devastation of Pearl Harbor, and a whole series of losses in the Pacific, and help Americans believe that they can really win this war.
Sam Kleiner is our guest. The book is The Flying Tigers, the untold story of the American pilots who waged a secret war against Japan. These pilots had to have been recruited secretly. They had to have been trained secretly. Certainly, they were not of your basic military, cut from the basic military cloth. The personalities that must have been a requirement for someone to take on what really on paper must have seemed a crazy type of mission for them, to take on the entire Japanese Air Force and to fight over China, and not even to have organization, basic military organization and planning. Claire Chanel emerges, of course, as the leader of the Flying Tigers. Talk about him, if you would.
Absolutely, and that's part of what makes it such a fascinating story. When I talked to the last surviving Flying Tigers, named Frank Wazowski, he lives down in Columbus, Georgia. I was with him a couple of weeks ago and was able to give him the finished book, and that just meant so much to me to be able to tell him that this story was going to be preserved. And he'll talk about when they first got over there and they're training in the secret base in the remote jungles of Burma, how they had monkeys living in their barracks, just kind of things that you would never hear about from a normal Army unit. But as you said, they kind of really fomented together into a cohesive unit under the leadership of Claire Chennault, who became a very famous military leader. And he's a fascinating guy. I was able to work through his diaries and letters to get more insight into him. But he was basically an Army stunt pilot who was forced out of the Army, had a lot of disagreement with his superiors in 1937, and took up an invitation to go to China to advise their Air Force, leaving behind a wife and 7 children, because, as he put it in a letter to his brother, he felt there was a chance to make history. And he was really instrumental in forming the Flying Tigers and leading them. And there was just a whole host of fascinating characters in the ranks. Pappy Boyington went on to become one of the more famous pilots from the war, and he was basically recruited not because he knew anything about China, but because someone came up to him at a bar in Pensacola, Florida, where he was a naval aviator, and he's got a whole bunch of gambling debt. His wife's just left him, and he might be forced out of the Navy, and they say, how would you like to go fly planes in China against the Japanese? And he didn't really know anything about the mission and didn't really care. It was just kind of a chance to get out and see more of the world and have an adventure. And that's what makes the story so fun in some ways, is, all these guys, these are children of the Great Depression who want an opportunity to see more of the world and make something of themselves, and they kind of accidentally become heroes overnight right after Pearl Harbor.
And it's really the birth of modern aerial warfare, too, and America is right there involved in it, even though they can't say. There's another facet of this story, and the fact you mentioned that most of the fighting was over the skies of China. And the way that the Flying Tigers were able to work with the Chinese, and in particular with Madame Chiang Kai-shek, which is just a whole nother dynamic of this story that I'm sure most Americans aren't even aware of.
Absolutely, and there's so much in this story that's kind of going on behind the scenes, and I talk a lot about the kind of behind closed doors machinations that were going on in Washington, D.C. to get this off the ground, so secret meetings at the White House. Secretary Morgenthau would have meetings over at his home so that they wouldn't, the Chinese officials wouldn't be spotted at the Treasury Department. And then when they're over in China, they work very closely with Madame Chiang, who's the wife of the Chinese premier. But much more than that, she's really the steward of the Chinese Air Force. And so a lot of these pilots have the chance to meet her. She was considered the most powerful woman in the world at the time, and worked very closely with her. So there's just so many fascinating characters. And I think it's important, when we think of World War II, we generally think of, the landings at D-Day, or we might think of the flag raising at Iwo Jima. But it's important that we also remember that China was an important ally in the war. It's been called the forgotten ally. And I think, with all of the issues going on with China today, this is a really important part of our shared history, and it tells us a lot about, the nature of what had been the relationship between the U.S. and China. And it's a reminder that we don't have to be enemies, that there actually is this shared story of us taking on this great struggle together. And I think that's really important and relevant history for us to keep in mind now.
The book is fresh. I mean, it's just out last week. The Flying Tigers, The Untold Story of the American Pilots Who Waged a Secret War Against Japan. It's from Penguin Random House, also available as an ebook. Since it's come out last week and people have had their chance to get their hands on it and start reading it, what have you heard about it? What are some of the reactions you're getting?
Well, it's been great. We've had pieces in the National Review, and a lot of places online have been covering it. sales have been really great, which clearly means it's resonating and people are interested in this era. But the most meaningful thing for me is to get emails and Facebook messages from the families of the surviving tigers and saying that this is helping them to understand more about their own family and helping them communicate it to their children and to pass that legacy on. And that's ultimately what this book is about, is helping us to preserve a piece of our history that otherwise this gets lost, and it's important for us to retell these stories that have been lost.
It's an amazing...
Thank you so much for having me on to talk about it, and the book's available wherever books are sold, including on Amazon.
You bet it is. It is The Untold Story Until Now. Sam Kleiner, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.